from around the world, and I think he landed in San Francisco, on a boat with $150 in his pocket, and he had to make his way to West Virginia, where he went to University of West Virginia on an engineering scholarship. And he loved America, and he was a teenager during World War II in the Philippines and missed several years of school because of World War II. Was forced to learn Japanese, and for him, America was literally the country that saved his life, that was promise for the future, a great force for good. When I got the job at Notre Dame, they would go to the movies when he was growing up, and I don't know, in the Philippines in the 1940s, they had movie clips, and they'd show Notre Dame football highlights at the beginning of the movie clips. And so Notre Dame, too. So I grew up in a household that loved America, that America was the future, and my dad really, he didn't want it. He wanted me only to learn English because he wanted me to be an American. And so my position at Notre Dame, I run the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government. We're thinking a lot about the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and I've been thinking, will America celebrate America when we turn 250? And I'm not sure. And so I think a lot of our anxieties, this is just to echo what Patrick said, that hope and optimism that, my father came here from, we've lost that somehow, I think. I think that is a cause of our anxiety.
We had a naturalization ceremony here in the auditorium yesterday, and it was a room filled with people who love this country. But I can think of lots of places where I would be surrounded by people in this land, by people who don't love this country. And I won't name actual places, although I've got some names. So let's think about this a little bit in terms of how we got here, and then how that relates to the theme of tonight's discussion about, is this sort of baked into the whole American experiment that it was going to end up looking something like this? Or is this an aberration, a kind of breaking of the promise? And if so, when and how did such breaking occur? So Philip, I'll let you go first on that one.
Oh boy, that's a big question. I think back, so I studied Lincoln, and my favorite person to teach is Lincoln. My two favorite Americans are Abraham Lincoln and Clarence Thomas. I guess that maybe reveals where I am on the political spectrum. George Washington and Frederick Douglass are 3 and 4. And when I teach Lincoln, so in my class I go from Lincoln to Woodrow Wilson. And Lincoln, if you read Lincoln's speeches, he's always calling us back to our ancient faith. And by that he meant the Declaration of Independence. And this is how he thought we should deal with the problem of slavery. The political question at the time was what to do about slavery in the territories. Do you allow slavery to go in the territories or do you not? This is in the 1850s. And Lincoln said, no, we should not allow slavery to go into the territories. There's nothing we can do about slavery in the states because it's the state questions, but we shouldn't allow it to expand. And why shouldn't we allow it to expand? Because slavery is in contradiction to our ancient faith, that all men are created equal. And he said that over and over. He said, as evil as slavery is, we can be dedicated Americans as long as we believe that slavery is in the course of ultimate extinction. And slavery will be in the course of ultimate extinction if we retain our fundamental belief in human equality, that all men are created equal. Fast forward to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson said, don't pay attention to the Declaration of Independence. Right? And that change that happened in that 50-year period, I think is perhaps when we began to lose our ancient faith of human equality. And we've forgotten the fundamental dignity of all human individuals as individuals. And now we group people in different ways and give them status or not status based on different characteristics. And I think that's fundamentally parasitic on our understanding of the possibility of brotherhood, of loyalty, of patriotism, of being one people. I think it's been going on for about a century now.
Patrick?
Well, so we've been invited here not just to agree with each other, but occasionally to disagree with each other. I mean, I think it's interesting to have us together because we agree on so much. I think if you were to ask us sort of issue for issue, you'd find a lot of agreement. But I think Philip and I represent two very different ways of understanding in the American past and the recent past. And in some ways, I think because we come from a place of a lot of agreement, those differences are actually kind of interesting. It's not like switching between Fox and MSNBC, where there's no conversation. We actually agree on a lot, as I think our first answer suggests, but disagree quite a bit on where things went wrong. And I would say that I would have a difficult time sort of giving a date or a thinker. I think it's a little bit more like the frog being boiled, that it's not clear when the temperature got quite so hot, but you can see, if you look in retrospect, how the temperature was rising over a period of time. But I think in particular that, what was the title of the book that was supposed to be discussed tonight? Order and Liberty?
Liberty.
Order and Liberty. I think this was Gordon Wood's, his book. So to honor the absent guest, I think a lot of the difficulties and problems of America right now go to the imbalance between these two goods, these two positive goods that I think every human being recognizes as a good. It is a good thing to live in a condition of liberty, in a condition in which you can chart your path, in which you have the ability to make decisions, genuine decisions about your life path, your family, who you will wed, where you will live, the kind of career you will pursue, but that there is also a genuine good of order. And indeed, without order, there can't be any real liberty, as we know. Right? How can you be thought to be genuinely free in a condition where there's a lack of order? And I think in many ways, I would identify the problem of the frog being boiled as one in which the imbalance has gone way off the charts as an embrace of liberty. And I think this embrace of liberty is bipartisan. It takes different forms, but it's bipartisan, and I think it's reflected in what has been the kind of political reaction that we've seen in the last several years from across the world in the form of what we call populism today. And that reaction, no matter what you think of populism or Donald Trump or Brexit, that reaction has been, I take it, a demand for a rebalancing from people who are not experiencing liberty as a positive good, but as the condition of a kind of disorder. The liberty that has created disorder in their lives is, on the one hand, a form of kind of a radical doctrinaire economic libertarianism that has taken the form of globalization, of outsourcing of jobs. I don't have to tell people in Michigan too much about that. The devastation to our domestic manufacturing, which was affected through policy in Washington and in the states, as well as, of course, decisions that were made by companies, that were taken in the belief that a kind of an order of a free market that didn't take into account the needs of a nation to have certain kinds of production, to produce certain kinds of goods, that it's an essential thing to have pharmaceuticals produced in your country, it turns out, right? Having it all produced in China may not be the best idea. So on the one hand, there was this economic liberty that caused a lot of suffering in this part of the country and in lots of other parts of the country. And at the same time, advanced by the political left, there was a form of liberty, especially in the form of lifestyle liberty, to be and express myself in whatever way I might wish, especially in the realm of human relationships, our sexual relationships. That has, on the one hand, allowed people to express themselves, but on the other hand, has demoted the central importance of the formation of families and the raising of children, which we've seen devastated as a kind of an assumed way of life, especially among those who are economically the least likely to be successful in our country. In other words, in both these domains, the economic domain and in the social domain, an excess of liberty has fallen hardest on the people who are least capable financially of dealing with the effects of this. The acceleration of this, of course, has been vivid in the last 10, 20 years, to the point now where we see this radical divide that didn't exist at the time. I mean, the economic divide existed, but not the divide in the sense that you are either going to be successful in this world or completely devastated. A country cannot survive when you have either a small class of people who will be successful, skating above and enjoying a world of unbounded liberty, and a people who will be largely unable to swim in those conditions. And I think that has led to the sense that we no longer are a country. We are no longer bound to each other. And I think unless we rebalance liberty and order, in significant part by emphasizing something that was emphasized at the time of our founding, as Gordon Wood, I'm sure, would have talked about, order, we're not likely to assuage this divide, and in fact is only likely to get worse.
I wonder if you can clarify that a little bit. When you say order, what's the ordering principle there to which you're referring, or the ordering force to which you are referring? Like some might say, for example, that things are ordered according to tradition or the past. Or some might say that things are properly ordered simply by government fiat. Some might say that things are ordered by the will of the majority. So the kind of order that provides the proper restraint to liberty, what's the ordering principle there? How does that order occur?
I don't know if we have to say these are all mutually exclusive. It seems to me we can think about these as, in some respects, mutually reinforcing. So I think I would be the first to emphasize, and Dr. Paulette and I were part of, in fact, a still-going concern called Front Porch Republic, an online magazine, that really emphasized the essential centrality of local forms of life, the importance of localism, the importance of feeling roots, of being parts of traditions, of developing memory and a sense of obligation to one's places and the people in those places. I see Annette Kirk here in the second row. This is, of course, Russell Kirk's great themes, right? This is the kind of conservatism that takes a kind of cultural form, you could say, that conserves over time, through generations, in and through people in places and with memory. This is instantiated in monuments, in plaques around a city. I often like to point out to students, you can tell something about how Notre Dame and most institutions have changed by looking at the names of the buildings. If the buildings were named for a person who was somehow associated with the place because they were a professor or a priest, in the case of Notre Dame, or the college president, that was old Notre Dame. If it's named for a donor, that's new Notre Dame. So memory of the people who built those places. Right? Notre Dame, among other things, here's old Notre Dame, has 2 cemeteries. It's hard to not pass a cemetery as you enter the campus. It's a place that fosters memory. That's central. Everything I've just described is absolutely central. But no less central is law. Right? We know that there can't be order without law. And law has to take the form, now in the American system it takes the form that it can be local law. It can be very local law. It can be the law of the Grand Rapids city law. It can be county law. It can be state law, and it can be federal law. And here I would say simply as a good Catholic that the law should reflect the level that's necessary to affect that law. if you're going to be making laws about what, whether these streets should be one-way or two-way, that probably should be in Grand Rapids. If you're going to make a law about whether or not Apple should have a monopoly, you're probably going to need the federal government. So it seems to me that you're going to need forms of authority in lots of spheres of life in order to have some form of order. But we shouldn't see these as mutually exclusive. We need to understand how these things must necessarily work together.
So I'm hearing you say in part that we're living in an era of a crisis of authority, right? That our institutions, not just our governing institutions, but in some sense all our institutions have lost their authority, and in part they've lost their authority because they're not performing the functions for which they are well designed. So how did that come to be? I'm struck by listening to both of you. We're coming up on the semi-quincentennial of the Declaration of Independence. And a lot of nations, when they think about who they are or what they are as a nation, they'll sort of look into the deep, dark, and misty past, and they'll have all these myths and maybe heroic figures or something like that, or battles. America seems to me to be the only country that locates its origins in documents. I think there's something unusual about that, the role that documents play in our self-identification as Americans, and maybe particularly the Declaration. Does the Declaration give us a blueprint for a kind of diminishing of authority, or does it give us a kind of proper balancing of the concerns of liberty and order? Philip, it's a Declaration of Independence.
Yeah,
right?
these are great questions. They're huge and big questions. So, the Declaration is a revolutionary document. It's to declare independence. It's to throw over tyranny. So in that sense, it emphasizes change and improvement, and it's anti-authority. On the other hand, the Declaration says we're throwing off this government so we can institute a new one that will better secure liberty. So the Declaration is not opposed to law. It's opposed to unjust law or unjust rule. And that goes, I guess, to the American character, right? We are an entrepreneurial people, that we don't suffer fools gladly. We don't bow to tradition just because it's old. That's in the beginning. So we still are a sort of revolutionary people. And I think of the great crises of America, whether it's the Civil War or the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. And these were, in a way, grounded in the Declaration. We need to change things because there's a lot of injustice. There's injustice, We're a propositional country that, was born in original sin. And in some ways, many of our problems still date to that, the problems we have, especially with race, right? That we didn't get it right at the beginning. I'm a huge fan of the founders. I think we don't realize how blessed we are to have George Washington. And let me just sidetrack for a story. In 2010, I had one of the most interesting experiences of my life. I was invited to go to Iraq to give a series of lectures on the Federalist Papers. So this was up in the American University in Iraq, which is in Suleimania, the Kurdish region. And they loved Americans in the Kurdish region. And I was lecturing to college students. They're all 18 to 21. None of them had spoken English when they were 15. They all learned English.
Told us this would happen.
They all learned English so they could take these classes at the American University of Iraq. So I gave all these lectures on the American founding, kind of like what we're doing right now in Iraq. And at the end of the week, they said, well, this is all the stuff about federalism is really interesting, and Declaration of Independence is really interesting. But how do we do this? How do we secure independence in Iraq? As if I knew. And the thought I had in my mind was, it's like I learned it for the first time. You can't just have the Federalist Papers. You can't just have the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, wow.
The backup has failed. The backup of the backup.
I said to them, you also need George Washington. None of this worked without the character of George Washington. So the documents are great and the ideals are great, but you also need great human beings. George Washington could have been king and gave up power. That's a remarkable act of human virtue. Abraham Lincoln gave his life to serve his country, right? Martin Luther King. Where is that leadership now? In these times of crisis. That's what we're missing.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I actually want to push back against your question in a way, and in some ways amplify something that Philip was saying, and maybe push it even further. Which is that I actually think one of the problems that, in particular, since there's I think we all sort of self-identify as conservatives of some kind. This is all a setup. Although you won't know that now from the things I said about economics. I'm not a libertarian, I'm a conservative. That actually the emphasis on our documents as that, the founding documents, as that what it is we focus on as Americans, is actually relatively new in the sense that it is almost exclusively, it has become exclusively the way that we identify ourselves as Americans. That when we think about what it is to be an American, we think about what the Declaration says or what the Constitution says. And I think it's new in part because what it was to be an American as an heir and inheritor of a certain kind of a culture and a certain set of beliefs became attenuated, and it became attenuated not because there were new immigrants. That was always the case. I'm an Irish Catholic, and when I was a kid, we would have to sing a song, "My Country 'Tis of Thee," in which we talked about our Pilgrim's pride. Now, as an Irish Catholic, I didn't have a lot to do with the Pilgrim's pride, and yet I was singing the song, talking about "My Country 'Tis of Thee," which is to the tune of "God Save the Queen." So, God Save the King, sorry.
Yeah, that's good.
I know.
Read a headline.
Updated,
Yeah.
yes. That increasingly to be an American became identified more and more with a set of theories, with a set of abstract principles. And I'm not saying those abstract principles are wrong, but those abstract principles can become wrong or become problematic when they're detached from real things. And I'm thinking in particular of the praise of the Declaration of Independence. And I'll be the first to say the Declaration of Independence says some good things. But it also says some things that are really problematic. That we are fundamentally, our fundamental essence and nature is that we are rights-bearing creatures, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I know this now I'm going to sound anti-American, but I'm not anti-American. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, if that's what makes us common, if that's what we are commonly Americans, then we don't have much in common. What we have in common is that we all agree that we're all about pursuing our happiness. We all have these rights in which we do our own things. These rights become detached from what we share, the communities of which we're a part, the histories that we share, this deeper sense of what we have inherited. And I think back to when I was growing up, and it seems, well, I guess it was half a century ago. It seems almost several centuries ago. And when we were learning what it was to be an American, we were learning primarily about the people. We were learning about the exemplars, including George Washington, including, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." I grew up in Connecticut, so the New England was a big one. We had to go to the homestead. Every year we went to the homestead of Nathan Hale. Those of you who know the story of Nathan Hale. Now, he was the good trader. The other guy from Connecticut, he was the bad trader. His name was Benedict Arnold. We also learned about him. The good trader was the trader who brought us information from the Brits. The bad trader was the trader who betrayed George Washington and betrayed the future America for the Brits. We had to learn about Betsy Ross. We had to learn about all of these figures. We learned, in other words, that these words and these ideas were bound up with particular people, were bound up with particular histories. And most importantly, I think this is what Philip was emphasizing, gave us sort of exemplifications of heroism, of duty, of self-sacrifice, of those who gave greater than themselves for a cause beyond themselves. Now, how do you square that with a world in which what we are is the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that's all we are? If you drop out those figures that teach us about what it is to be committed to duty and principle and a way of life beyond oneself and beyond one's own lifetime, then what do you get? You get a lot of people like a lot of our countrymen today who are pretty much in it for themselves. So my quibble isn't with the Declaration of Independence. My quibble is with the way in which it and the principles of America have become detached from some deeper substratum that teaches us that none of these principles can possibly bring together a people and a nation without some deeper commitments and sense of inheritance that go beyond our own lifetime and our own selves.
Philip, you described America earlier as a propositional nation. That seems to be at least a little in tension with what Patrick just said.
Yeah, it is. It is in tension with that. I don't.
This is why we never see each other in the halls.
Yeah. I think our understanding of rights is a little bit more complex and a little bit more nuanced and not so individualistic. Rights are just a way to talk about justice, what we owe each other. So I don't. When I hear rights, I hear that we're a nation committed to justice. Certainly imperfectly. In our founding, this was our great original sin. So I don't hear selfishness. I don't hear we're only concerned with our own individual interest. Maybe rights allow that selfishness to develop, but we're imperfect beings. But I hear that we're committed to justice as a nation and treating individuals as individuals of dignity that demand to be treated a certain way because they're all children of God. So I see rights connected to duties, how we have to treat each other, how we ought to treat each other. And I think if we overemphasize the particular people, I'm the son of an immigrant. My connection to this country is through its ideals. And not everyone can connect to a certain lineage or being from New England or a certain culture. I actually think that's what makes America the land anyone can be an American. So I think it's a mistake to downplay our rights tradition. I think that rights tradition can go awry, and it did. And I think of decisions in the '60s that, like with pornography and things like that. And when you teach these, I wasn't alive in the '60s, but I imagine that those justices in the '60s who were saying, look, we can't really outlaw pornography, they had no idea what pornography would be 50 years later. They look so naive now in what we've unleashed on our children. I have 3 little kids. Right? My oldest is 11. We're terrified of the internet. It's impossible to raise kids today. I mean, the images they will see by accident. Well, that's a direct consequence of a combination of bad Supreme Court decisions and a sort of corporate profits and the worst part of deviations from rights. So I'm somewhat sympathetic that rights can go awry. But those decisions in the 60s were bad. Misunderstanding of rights and overemphasis. This is what I think Professor Deneen was saying at the beginning of the evening. And I think we're paying the consequences of those misunderstandings. Again, we're imperfect beings, right? These things happen, but we have to correct course.
On to that, or?
Well, I know that I disagreed with my colleague about many things. I didn't realize how deep the disagreement was.
I'm glad we brought you here for this.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I don't know how you're getting home, Philip.
I know, I know.
But good luck.
If anyone's driving back to South Bend tonight.
Going to South Bend? Your thumb still works, right? No, I think it's in some ways precisely, I mean, I think what you just said in many ways illustrates precisely my concerns, which is by detaching a theory of rights in some ways from its history, from the circumstances that significantly gave rise to their securing and their practice, it seems to me isn't uncoincidental to what you describe as having gone awry. So if you're going to make the claim only by, in some ways, bracketing the histories in order to give us the purified rights, absent in some ways of stories and exemplars of those duties, we should have no surprise and no wonder at a condition in which people will claim those rights without any recognition of the accompanying duties and responsibilities and costs of those rights. I mean, the Declaration, I think, states very clearly what we should see as the essential history of those rights. And it's in its concluding words that are not as often invoked as the most famous ringing passages that are the most revolutionary or revolution-oriented of those words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The concluding words are the ones in which the men who signed that document, including John Hancock, whose name I can still sign to this day. It's pretty good. Give me a fountain pen and I can make a pretty good version of it. And to this declaration, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Think about that. Signing your name to this document, as dozens of men did, meant that they were pledging their lives. Right? So how does that comport with the idea that I have a right to my life? Well, your right to your life ends when you pledge your life for a cause. That's a pretty interesting statement. We have a right to life, but my life is also not just worth living if it's not on the terms that I'm going to lay out in this document. So right there in the document, there's no detached right to life. The men who signed this document said, I'm willing to give my life. And many did. Their fortunes. All of our worldly accumulations, all of us are watching our stock portfolios decline, our retirement income we're worried about all that. Hope you're all invested in gold. Our fortunes are declining, perhaps. Imagine pledging your fortune by signing your name. And this is the one that really gets me. Our sacred honor. What does that mean? Well, if they lose George Washington's name, John Hancock's name, Charles Carroll's name is dirt. They're the Benedict Arnolds of the greater British Empire forever. Forever. Their names will be taught as if they were what we now consider Benedict Arnold to be. And that's, of course, the worst thing. You can lose your life, you can lose your fortune, but to be forever remembered as a traitor and as a horrible exemplar.
Bottom level of hell.
Yeah, it is the bottom level of hell in Dante. So I think that concluding sentence of the Declaration doesn't get nearly enough airtime, because what it teaches us is that these rights are only secured by the greatest form of self-sacrifice. And these are the stories we have to tell at the same time that we're telling the stories, or at least extolling the rights that we bear as Americans.
I hear you saying in part that that experiment, that project could work because the culture was already producing the kind of people who could engage in heroic acts, who recognized their duties, who possessed the right kind of virtue. And now, going back to what we said at the beginning, it seems we're not producing those kinds of people. So it's as if these documents are laid over a cultural inheritance that was already working, and that cultural inheritance has been spent down. How do you renew that? How do you replenish that kind of inheritance that will get people to pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors for something greater than themselves?
Well, the temptation in a free society is always to think we as individuals and we collectively are responsible to no one but ourselves. This temptation is as old as the Hebrew scripture. It says, mankind has not changed, right? This is the issue of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's the issue in the Tower of Babel. It's the deformation of the understanding of rights. Let me go back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So we're having this great crisis on what to do about slavery. And Lincoln, as I said earlier, says, our ancient faith, all men are created equal. All men have rights. Where do those rights come from? From our Creator. That is, rights are embedded in or natural rights are embedded in a framework of natural law. There is right and wrong, moral right and moral wrong by nature. It is wrong to treat innocent people as if they're slaves. That's what you can't just take someone's life. That's what it means to have a right to life. Rights are a way of talking about moral right and moral wrong, or what I said about justice. And so Lincoln said, in this great question about what to do with slavery, the people can't do anything. The people have to respect the moral law. What Stephen Douglas said is, if the people of this territory want slavery, let them have it. If they want freedom, let them have it. Let them have it. The people decide what is right and wrong. There's nothing above the people. He literally says that. I don't care whether Kansas or Nebraska have slavery. We should be democratic. If the people want slavery, they can have it. The people decide what's right and wrong. That is the great temptation of a free people, to think that there's nothing above the authority of the people, that the people are the moral law. All of our great sins are sins of pride as a nation, of not respecting the moral law that grounds our rights and therefore grounds the limits to our rights. And I think in some ways we've forgotten that today. I think we've forgotten it in our foreign policy. That's another question, that we can just do anything. When you think you can do anything, you get into wars you can't win. When you think you can just do anything domestically, you don't pay attention to how your economic policies hurt the most vulnerable. You don't pay attention how your Supreme Court decisions make children vulnerable. It's a form of pride in not respecting a higher moral law. And it's not a coincidence that we've had the decline of religion. I mean, we're living through one of the most interesting times, right? You see this as a college professor. This is less true at Notre Dame. It's not that young people are rejecting religion today. Young people have been brought up without any religion at all. That's a radical change from even my upbringing. It may not be terrible, it may be terrible. Religion is one of those cultural bedrocks that reminded us that, yes, we're a free people, but there are there are moral limits to how we use our freedom. And every time we as a people have forgotten those moral limits, our rights have been detached from moral boundaries, and we act pridefully, and that leads to disastrous consequences.
Patrick?
It's not that I disagree with what Professor Munoz says. I would begin by placing the emphasis somewhat differently, which is not to say that the decline of religion is not of the utmost seriousness. I just don't think that religion has declined. I just think a new religion has arisen. And the new religion that has arisen is the religion of the detached, liberated self, and all that accompanies that. I don't know if some of you remember when Robert Bellah wrote a book some years ago. What was the title of it?
Bowling Alone.
No, that's Putnam.
Bella.
The
Habits
of the Heart.
It was a Tocquevillian. You had to search.
It was a Tocquevillian essay, but book. But there was one part in the book in which he interviewed a woman named Sheila who worshipped Sheila. She said she claimed that she was a worshiper of the religion of Sheilaism. And I think in many ways that's become the dominant religion of America today, which is the religion of ourselves, the religion of the autonomous, liberated self. And the worst thing that you can confront the liberated, autonomous self with is the idea that you are not a liberated, autonomous self. You are an heir to a lot of things, practices, events, ideas, philosophies that preceded your life. You are a person who's bounded by all kinds of limitations. Let's just start with the idea that the language that you grow up in is actually going to deeply influence how you think. If you know a second language well enough, you realize there are certain things I can express in Hebrew or in German or in French that I can't say in English.
Dutch.
What's that?
Dutch.
Dutch. Sorry, I forget where I am. Those of you who speak Dutch. Yeah. Having to grow up in this particular language limits what I can think. There are all kinds of limits in the world. And so the one thing that the religion of Sheilaism, or whatever your ism is if you're the self-creating self, rebels against is the idea that you are an inheritor of something. So nearly every academic institution in America, with the exception of a few private colleges and the land-grant universities, began as religious institutions. And those institutions taught the faith of their traditions. And we still have some evidence of that. Calvin College, maybe Hope College, where Jeff used to teach, sometimes Notre Dame in the Catholic tradition. But of course, most of those institutions have, at least for a century, disaffiliated, claiming that they are no longer going to teach any particular religion. But if we, in fact, look at what they are doing, they are teaching the new religion. And the new religion is in some ways the opposite of the old religion, whatever that might have been. The old religion, among other things, thought it was really important. We should learn our inheritance. We should learn the past. Every one of these institutions required courses in history so that you knew the past and you would know something of what it is that you inherited and what you owed. And this is what, in part, we've been talking about tonight. You should know what Gerald Ford did. You should know who he was. You should know what he represented. You should know in the ways in which he can be an exemplar and the ways he may have fallen short. But we can't evaluate who we are unless we know something of the past. And if you walk around many of these institutions, what you see are buildings that are supposed to look much older than the institutions. Walk around Notre Dame, it's supposed to look like a medieval university created in the 1840s. These old buildings. Because it's supposed to be a paragon of the collective wisdom of the past. And the most important institution above all in that institution is the library, maybe the chapel or the church, but the library, because that's where memory is stored. That's where you store the past. Now what happens when the old religion is overturned and the new religion takes its place? You don't tear down the buildings, you just put different people into them. You have the appearance of antiquity, but with a radically new teaching that's taking place inside of those classrooms. What's that teaching? Well, look at the basic curriculum of a history major these days. Look at the courses that are being offered in the history department, where you might still have a course required in history. It's all about how terrible the past was. It's all about how all of the evils that have ever existed were all in the past. How it was a time of sexism, racism, homophobia, colonialism, any ism that you can imagine is all found in the past. So what's the first thing you have to start doing? Well, you have to start taking the names off of those buildings. You have to start taking down the statues. You have to erase the past, because unless we do that, we can't be liberated. We can't engage in the religion of our independent, autonomous, rights-bearing selves. So I think we do have a religion. I think it's a bad religion. There have been bad religions. I think it's being taught on our college campuses quite extensively. So if we want to look for something practical to do, it would be, in the first instance, well, those of you who are parents, make sure you're not sending your kids to those kinds of schools. If you're grandparents, make sure your kids are not sending their kids to those kinds of schools. If you're donating to these schools, make sure you're not donating to those kinds of programs. But more than that, we need to reclaim these institutions. And here, Jeff, to get back to your earlier question, here you might need to use law. You might need to use authority. And I'm actually encouraged to see states, this is going to now make me very controversial, but states, governors and state legislatures saying, we're not going to embrace or permit or encourage this religion to continue on our state-funded campuses. We're going to attempt to reclaim our land-grant institutions. Now that's authority, and I approve of that message.
With that, I would like to take some audience questions, and I'd like to remind the audience that we are looking for questions and not speeches.
Unlike us.
Yeah.
Good evening and welcome to Grand Rapids. My question is, I've read that 1% of the population of the planet enjoys more wealth than the other 99% combined, and that in the United States that disparity is 10% and the bottom 50% combined. How does that affect the issues that you're addressing this evening? Thank you.
I do. I'd be curious to know how that differs from a lot of human history. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. I don't have those statistics on hand. I suspect for a lot of human history, wealth has been testing. I suspect wealth has been concentrated in relatively few hands for a long period of time. But that said, there have been a few times of somewhat miraculous, relatively more fair distribution of wealth in the American context. And oddly enough, two of those times are times about which conservatives of a certain kind are somewhat nostalgic. One of those times was actually, surprisingly, at the time of the American founding, which might surprise us, but it was a fairly middle-class society, which there were a few wealthy people, but there was a pretty widespread distribution of property. It was largely in the form of farms, but people were relatively equal. And if you want a really good primer on this, there's a wonderful book called The Middle Class Constitution, which is all about this. That at the time of the American founding, one of the things that reflected the order of America was the fact that it was a relatively economically egalitarian society, which is not to say there weren't wealthy people, but it was a relatively egalitarian society. The point at which America becomes relatively more or approximately egalitarian as it was at the time of the founding is in the 1950s, in the period after World War II. And it was a time of course, immense wealth as the result of America's victory in World War II, but it was also a time of a fairly strong working class movement. Unions for private institutions were strong. Corporations were much more likely to grant compensation, especially in the forms of benefits to workers. Many of the, what we think about as the sort of golden packages of that time came out of that period, retirement plans, health care plans, and so forth. It was also a time, though, I would underscore, in fact, both of these times were a time of profound social stability. So attendant to the economic egalitarianism of those times, you had strong sense of family, community, commitments to those institutions that made the lives of people strengthened in and through their relationships. I think in some ways what we have right now is in some ways the reverse of both of those situations. In the United States today, we have rather extreme forms of economic inequality that maybe begins to approximate maybe not 1%, but maybe 5 to 10% of the wealth of the greatest wealth of the country. But also attendant to that, profound social dislocation, as I mentioned in the beginning, especially in the working and lower classes, where we see mortality rates at levels that should stagger someone in a civilized Western world, right? Declining lifespans among those who used to be part of the backbone, the working class backbone of the American citizenry, and of course addictions, the kinds of social breakdown, crime, and so forth. So I think that we should be working in some ways against what I would see as both of the main agendas of what I think dominate the right and the left today, and this brings me back to where I began. We should be working, those who seek to rebalance liberty and order should be working against an economic order that has tended to concentrate wealth in very few hands. But at the same time, we should be working against a social order that it seems to me is, if not contributing to, certainly not helping the breakdown of family, communal, and associational life in America today. In an odd way, then, it would be putting America back, in some ways, to where it once was, and that is our rightful legacy. If we are going to be proud of something from our past, it's a time in which we were relatively equal and had highly stable lives, whether or not you were in the upper class or the lower classes of our society.
Yep, next question in the back there.
Thank you both for coming to our great community here. I am a member of the Gerald R. Ford Leadership Forum, which is a student organization which is pushing back against this unraveling of fundamental truths, I think, that this country was built upon. And thank you for interacting with this fantastic foundation. My question for you is, I often struggle with this issue of liberty and order, and I have a profound distrust in so many institutions that we used to rely upon in this country, because through my education, I've seen how they've become corrupted by the private sector, or just clear forms of profiting from a position which you should be serving. What mechanisms do you see as the solutions to rebuilding those foundational political and cultural and social aspects that this country was built upon, those fundamental details? I'm just curious from your perspective. Thank you.
Well, let me speak for my generation. I'm a Gen Xer. Maybe you could let us take over. Thankful for all that you've done, but maybe constitutional amendment that you have to be under 65 to run for president might be where I'd start. I'm serious.
Is that your answer?
Well,
Which one is working?
It's a big question. I'm Catholic. Catholic Church as an institution is not trusted by many, and they don't deserve the trust because of the corruption of people in authority. Corruption of people in authority destroys institutions. Fighting wars you don't win destroys confidence in institutions. I answer tongue in cheek, but we've had terrible leadership in this country for quite some time. That's a bipartisan statement. And we need better leadership in our educational institutions, in our corporations, in our political institutions, in our school boards. We need people concerned more for the common good than individual interest and advantage. We need policies that bring us together, not dole out benefits based on privileged status or color or orientation or what have you. And until we get, no one is talking about right now, no one in Washington is talking about how we're taking money from young people, some who are unborn, to spend lavishly now. It's not a financial issue, it's a moral issue. We have no right to do that to future generations. And no one is taking responsibility. So many of our problems are failures of moral leadership. And it's going to require other people to stand up, to not tolerate what's going on, and to take positions of responsibility.
Both of you have discussed tonight what to do about kind of divisions between liberal identity and inclusion-based politics and also a conservative, traditional value-based politics. Do you think possibly we could come to some reconciliation between the two by holding fast to our values while simultaneously attaching them to more diverse stories, perhaps learning in our education about both like Betsy Ross and maybe Crispus Attucks as symbols of the American dream?
Yeah, I would say the story is in some ways one of inclusion. I mean, the stories that I mentioned were especially, since the topic tonight was about the founding, I thought it was appropriate to mention a number of the figures who were central in that founding. The documents didn't just arise. They weren't like mushrooms that appeared. There were people who advanced those and who made sacrifices for those, and to whom, precisely as my colleague was just saying, without a recognition of the debts that we have, we're likely to think of ourselves as these self-created people who then won't have any concern for future generations. I think the core feature of what constitutes a good civilization, if I can put it in those terms, is understanding that you are just you're a sentence at best in a very long story. Maybe you're a word, maybe you're a vowel in a very long story. And so not only do we have an obligation as human beings to understand something of what constituted that story, and so I began at the time of the American founding and the people who helped to found that, but Crispus Attucks would be among those. But we would want to include a whole lot of voices in that story, certainly as we move forward. And I would certainly hope we can include a few Irish Catholics in that. Maybe once in a while, because there are a couple. Put in a word for my people, maybe a few Dutch as well. But that all of this inclusion is a recognition that we are also a part. Whether we get a prime spot in that story, we're all a part of it. But here's the thing about being part of a story. You also recognize there's a whole lot of blank pages after you that follow after your lifetime. That once you recognize I'm part of a narrative, the narrative doesn't end the day I die. It keeps going. And part of understanding that is then to see I have an obligation to make sure that those sentences, those words, those chapters are also going to be well written in the hopes that I can pass something on. So it's telling the story, not hating the fact that there was a past or seeking to erase it, and therefore engendering a sense of obligation to the future, a sense of what one owes as much as one inherits. I think the idea of inheritance is bound to the idea of gratitude and a sense of obligation to the future. So I think precisely, I would agree with you 100%, that this idea that the characters and who is included, of course, is going to change and alter, but all to the end and the purpose of understanding that this story continues.
Thank you very much for a very engaging conversation evening. So glad you were able to come up. I'd say for pinch hitters, they were pretty darn good. What do you think? Okay, Dr. Munoz, you get a prize here. Yours. Now, I'm not sure I'm going to give this one over to Dr. Deneen unless he promises he's going to take Philip back to Notre Dame.
I'll tie him to the roof.
Thank you both very
Thank
much.
you, thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, before you leave this stage, I just want to say a couple of things real briefly. First of all, you heard a whole lot said about community, about association. We aren't just islands unto ourselves. We are a community. And I look out at this audience and I see that. And that's one of the reasons we really enjoy here at the Ford being an institution in a community, Grand Rapids, that so appreciates association and the fact that we are tied together and that we care for each other and that we work hard for each other in this community. It's a phenomenal place. I'm not from here. And so when I think about how fortunate I am that my career has ended up here, it really is something. And I have you to thank for that. Everybody in this room, I think, feels the same way. You're friends of Ford, so of course. And because we are a community, no event like this happens in isolation. A lot of people work to make something like this happen. I want, first of all, to recognize a member of the Ford family, Greg Ford, who is here. Thank you, sir, for being here. We have a former trustee here, Mark Murray. I'm so pleased that you were able to join us tonight. Thank you, Mark. And I notice you're wearing Texas cowboy boots. We also have students who are here, our future. So much of this talk today was really concerning who is going to carry forward the torch and what kind of torch is it going to be? Is it going to be a kind of torch that is individualistic and sort of self-seeking and ugly? Is it going to be one that's more communitarian and giving and self-sacrificing? And I have to say that the students who are here from, I made a little tally, Grand Valley, Hope, Albion, Calvin, any other colleges or universities here represented that I missed. But thank you, students, for being involved, engaged in conversations like this. So it means a lot to us that you are here. And then we've got, of course, our great partners in the Ford Library and Museum. We can't do this work without the National Archives. We so appreciate you, Brooke, and your team. So this has been a wonderful evening because of all of you coming together for all the various reasons you're here. So thank you very much. Drive home safely.